All right, welcome back, Sebastian here. So today I want to do a quality review of the teammate head-to-heads for the 2025 F1 season through 14 rounds out of 24. I also want to compare what the results that we have so far compared to my preseason model expectations, and we can see, how wrong or how right it was in some cases. And then also I want to look at the gap between the two drivers in qualifying and how it's evolved over the course of the season so far. So the order that we're going to be going in is last year's Constructors Championship. I know, a bit weird, but that's just the way that the slides were arranged from before. So starting off with the first team that we'll be looking at, and that is, of course, Sauber. So for Sauber, Bortoleto, Hulkenberg, the two drivers this year, both new to the team. Bortoleto, of course, a complete rookie to Formula One. Now, the qualifying head-to-head is 8-6 in Bortoleto's favor, which is, I think, a little bit better from Bortoleto's perspective than I think many, myself included, thought. The median qualifying gap is 0.096 seconds in Bortoleto's favor, and when you compare that to the model's gap, which was 0.066 seconds in Hulkenberg's favor. So in absolute terms, it is not that far off. It's about a tenth and a half off. It does basically completely flip it around from being in Hulkenberg's favor to being in Bortoleto's favor. Now, average starting position, it's interesting to look at these for all 10 teams because you'll see when you look at how the median qualifying gap translates into differences in starting position, it does vary quite a bit, even within the grid and within the different groups on the grid. So for Bortoleto, 14.29, and for Hulkenberg, 15.86. So about a position and a half difference between the two drivers. Now, when you look at how that the qualifying gap has evolved over the course of the season, if you break the season down into 5 race chunks, of course, we've only gotten 4 races, so the last block is only 4 races, not 5. You'll see that's a pretty clear, trend where Bortoleto is getting stronger over the course of the season, which is exactly what you would expect for a rookie. So the first 5 race block, about a 10th advantage for Hulkenberg. Second 5 race block, about a 10th advantage for Bortoleto. And then this most recent block, it's about that advantage jumped all the way up to about 4/10. So a pretty big jump there. So it has been, a little bit interesting to see that. And Bortolero is definitely kind of really coming into his own, I think, over the course of the European leg of the F1 season. So it'll be interesting to see how he carries that momentum after the summer break, especially when we get to some of the Americas leg of the calendar. A lot of tracks that the rookie drivers especially will have not had any experience with because those tracks are not raced in the junior formula. Now, moving on to Williams, another new lineup. This one, I think there was quite a bit of intrigue. There was a lot of, I think, the expectation from the general F1 fan base and from the media as well was that Sainz would generally be a little bit better than Albon. It'll qualify by about 10th and a half or so over the course of the season, and that's not really what's happened so far. So Albon's ahead 8-6 in terms of the quality head-to-head with a median gap of 0.106 seconds. Now, my quality model, it had it so that the gap was very, very small between the two, but it was in Sainz's favor by 15 hundredths of a second. Now, average starting position, 10.29 for Albon and 11.77 for Sainz. So similar gap to Bortoleto and Hulkenberg, and a similar difference in starting position. Now, when you look at the race-by-race breakdown, it is a little bit a bit odd. It's definitely not the kind of straight line that we saw kind of with Bortoleto. Now, of course, Albon's actually won the head-to-head for all of the 3 different groups that we have, the 3 blocks that we have. First block, he had the advantage by half a tenth. Second block, he had the advantage by a tenth and a half. And then third tenth, the advantage again by half a tenth. So it has generally been in Albon's favor. Of course, there have been races where Sainz out qualified him, but generally when you look at these 5 race blocks, Albon's generally had the advantage pretty consistently throughout the season. And the fact that you had this weird lull, that second race block where the gap was almost 3 times bigger than the rest of the season, is a little bit of a surprise. And I think, but that being said, the fact that it went back down again, maybe this is the start of a positive trend for Sainz, and maybe Sainz will over those final 5 race blocks of the season, perhaps Sainz will have the upper hand and start out qualifying L1 more regularly than not. Now, moving on to Racing Bulls. Now, of course, this is a team that the driver lineup changed mid-season, one of 3 teams where that's the case this year. So, of course, the model predictions are not ones that I presented in my preseason predictions. These are ones I basically had to calculate at the time that the driver changes were announced. So for Racing Bulls, there are 2 drivers right now, of course, are Hadjar and Lawson. They've had 12 races together as teammates. Hadjar's leading the qualifying head-to-head 9-3, which is a pretty sizable gap. And, if Lawson even wanted to tie Hadjar over the course of for the rest of the season, he would have to out-qualify him 8-2 over the remaining round. So not highly likely, but again, it's stranger things have happened in Formula One. Median qualifying gap so far 0.169 seconds. So again, it is pretty sizable, one of the bigger ones on the grid, I would say, but it's definitely a lot smaller than it was recently. And when we look at the next slide, you'll definitely understand why. Now, the model really had Tsunoda and Lawson, I think, be quite too high. And this is the old model. So this was the model that I basically developed in previous years. And it's not the quality rating that I basically have been presenting the last week or so. So this old model basically predicted that Lawson would qualify Hadjar by 0.195 seconds. So that basically, when you look at the gap between what we actually have and what was predicted, it's about a 3.5 difference. A pretty big difference there between prediction and reality. So this is one where the model was definitely quite off. In terms of average starting position difference, 10.16 for Hadjar, 12.83 for Lawson. So when you compare it to the other ones where it's about a tenth, that extra 700 is basically an extra entire position difference, which just shows how big, how close things are in the midfield this year, and why qualifying is so crucial to being able to extract good performances even on a Sunday. Now, when you look at the race-by-race breakdown, now, of course, the first 5 race block, they were not teammates for 2 of those races. So the first block's 3 races, the last block's 4 races, and then the only one that's actually 5 is that middle block. So when you look at the block by block, first block was about a tenth in Hadjar's favor. Again, if you look at the y-axis, it's relative to Lawson. So again, being above the right line means it's in Hadjar's favor. But that first block about a tenth in Hadjar's favor. The second block about 3/10 in Hadjar's favor. That's where the gap actually increased. But again, that might just be bigger, because of the sample size change as well. But then that last block, interestingly enough, Lawson has been the one who's outqualified Hadjar by about, half a tenth, 400ths of a second or so. So again, you go from 3/10 to 400ths the other way. Pretty big swing there, which generally suggests that Lawson's kind of starting to get to grips with the car, perhaps. And I think the other reason why that's important is there's 2 things. One is that Hadjar is a lot less experienced than Lawson. There's 11 race difference, which is still, at this point in their respective F1 careers, that definitely does count for something. So you would expect that Hadjar would have a stronger, steeper growth curve, which means that in theory the gap should be getting bigger, not smaller, in terms of the qualifying performance between the 2. The other reason why it's important is that from here on out, Lawson has raced every single track remaining on the calendar with the exception of Baku, which means he has F1 experience at these tracks, something that in a lot of cases Hadjar does not. So the deck's going to actually be stacked a little bit against Hadjar from this point onwards. And that's kind of why I mentioned that 8-2. So if Lawson, for example, can win 8 of those final 10 qualifying head-to-heads, just because of recency bias, even if it's equal, like very equal at the end of the season, just because of the fact that it's been if that situation is to play out, it would be a complete reversal of how things were recently, and I think it would really alter people's perceptions of both Hadjar and Lawson's season if that were to play out. Now, I don't want to go into 2 more random hypothetical realities here, but before we do that, I just want to, move on to another team. So the next team that we're going to be looking at is Alpine. Of course, Alpine, 2 different basically sets of driver pairings here. So of course, they started the season with Gasly and Doohan, and we knew that, Doohan from the beginning of the season was on thin ice. Qualifying head-to-head during their 6 races together this season, 5-1 in Gasly's favor with a median qualifying gap of 0.46 seconds. Now, model gap was 3.5 tenths, so about a tenth bigger than what we thought. And I think Doohan's a really strange one qualifying. If you go back and include his first race in Abu Dhabi last year, there was this very strange trend in qualifying where the first run in Q1, often it was Q1, Doohan and Gasly would be very, very evenly matched in terms of qualifying pace. Doohan would maybe be, half a tenth ahead or maybe just half a tenth behind. But then more often than not, that second run in Q1, he would just find no time whatsoever. Something would happen. He would have, poor tire prep. He was in the pit lane for too long, had to rush out lap, something like that. Something would happen. And then Gasly would end up out qualifying him by 4 or 5 tenths of a second. And that happened, quite more often than it really should have, and more than you would really think that it would be possible to be by chance. So it was one of those odd particularities. And I know that for some publications, for example, the race, when they analyze, particularly when they compare Doohan and Colapinto in qualifying relative to Gasly, they will often point out that Doohan was actually closer in qualifying because they count. I'm pretty sure that how they count is they do it run by run within the session, whereas for me, I only take the final times within each session because ultimately that's all that really matters. Now, in terms of average starting position, 11.67 for Gasly and then 15.5 for Doohan. So a 5-position difference, which is pretty considerable. And when you're starting 15th in a car, that's not very good. Very, very hard to score points from there. Now, comparing that to Gasly and Colapinto, of course, quality head-to-head 6-2 in Gasly's favor. So it's simply from a percentage percentage perspective. Colapinto has a slightly better percentage than Doohan, but again, not a big difference there. Median qualifying gap 0.286 seconds. So it is about just under 2 tenths better when you look at those final numbers, but still pretty small sample sizes on both sides. And I do think both drivers generally have underperformed this season. Model gap, I think after Colapinto's stint against Alpine, using that data, it said that the gap between the two of them was potentially going to be 0.113 seconds. So again, I think if Colapinto was performing at level relative to Gasly, I think Alpine would be a lot more optimistic, a lot more receptive to his performance so far this year, but that's unfortunately not what we've gotten. Average starting position 12.88 for Gasly, 15.0 for Colapinto. And so despite the fact that Gasly's average starting position has gotten worse compared to his time with Doohan, Colapinto's is actually slightly better compared to Doohan. So again, a little interesting factoid there on that front. Now, unfortunately for Colapinto, when you look at the race-by-race breakdown in terms of the two groups, now he's done 8 races, so 4 in the second block and then 4 in the third block. The gap is not going in the right direction for him. So this is, of course, relative to Gasly. So the first block, or I guess the second block, I should say officially, the gap's about just under 3 tenths of a second, but then when you look at the third block, it's just over 3 tenths. So not a big difference there. Again, these block sizes are pretty small, so the fact that it's about maybe half a tenth's difference between the two is a pretty small change. So again, definitely within the range margin of error there, but still, it's not improving. I think for Alpine, there is going to be a lot of pressure on Colapinto the second half of the season to at least start showing signs of positive improvement. Start out qualifying Gasly. I think maybe more than 25% of the time, I would say, is just a good benchmark. Better than 25%, so maybe out of the remaining 10 races that we have, he should out qualify Gasly 3 to 4 times. I think would be an improvement on what we've seen so far. But if that's not the case, if things continue to kind of struggle along, and again, he might be out of a seat at the end of the season. Now, kind of like Lawson, a lot of the tracks that we have coming up second half of the season are, of course, tracks he raced with Williams last year. So again, there's an extra degree of familiarity there that wasn't there for these races that he's done so far. So again, maybe that will help him as well. Now, moving on to our next team, and that is Haas. Behrman and Ocon, a bit of a surprise, a bit like the Audi one with Bortoleto and Hulkenberg, but I think this one's probably a slightly bigger surprise, just because Bortoleto had, I think, a much stronger resume coming up to F1 compared to Behrman. So quality head-to-head 7-6 in Behrman's favor, with a median gap of 0.127 seconds. Now, even though there's only one quality win difference here between the two of them. The fact that the median is, over a tenth of a second is a little bit surprising. And I think it speaks to the fact that I think both drivers have generally been consistently inconsistent in qualifying. There was a run, I think, early in the season from races 2 to races 5, where they would basically trade races where they trade qualifying sessions where they would out-qualify each other by about 4 to 5 tenths of a second, which is why part of the reason why both drivers have pretty poor quality ratings on my quality rating model. Now, when you compare that to the model gap, it basically predicted that Ocon would out-qualify Berman by about 10. I remember there was a couple comments on that video, or at least one comment on that video that said that, Ocon was going to out-qualify Berman by like way more than that. And it turns out that's not the case. So I guess on that front, even though the number's about 2 tenths off of reality, again, perhaps a little bit more realistic than what some people may have thought. Now, a bit of an interesting twist here is that the average starting positions do not line up with qualifying results, given that the better qualifier actually has a worse starting position than his teammates. So for Berman, average starting position 16.00 flat, and then for Ocon 14.64, which is of course better than 16. And the part of the reason for that is that Berman had 2 major grid penalties, one at Monaco and one at Silverstone, the British Grand Prix, where he basically was forced to start, at or really close to the back of the grid. And that, of course, meant that he was basically, that basically was enough to basically shift the average down and kind of ruin that average starting position. That has definitely hurt Berman and has prevented him from, well, it hasn't prevented him, but it's given him less opportunities, made it harder opportunities for him to score points, which is part of the reason why the points deficit between the two drivers is what it is. Now, when you look at the race-by-race block breakdown, it's exactly as you would expect, going seesawing back and forth both sides. So the first block, 10th and a half advantage for Berman. Second block, about a 10th and a quarter or so advantage for Ocon, and then the third block, just over 2/10 advantage for Berman. So it kind of goes back and forth, and we'll see how this develops over the course of the season. Now, moving on to our next team, and this is the first team in our video where the driver lineups actually remain the same from last year. So this is Alonso and Stroll, of course, driving for Aston Martin. Now, a little bit like Norris and Piastri last year, I think the quality head-to-head is a little bit deceptive in terms of the actual performance difference between the two drivers. So, of course, Alonso's winning the quality head-to-head 14-0 as a 43-year-old. Very, very impressive. Well, I think he actually turned 44 very recently. But the median qualifying gap is actually relatively close. It's 0.188 seconds. And when you compare that to 2023 or 2024, it is an improvement and does kind of suggest that Alonso is kind of slowly but surely losing one lap performance. So that first year, 2023, average median qualifying gap of 0.411 seconds. That was, of course, a really poor year by Stroll, I think, especially coming off those double wrist surgery injuries. And I think he definitely performed a lot worse than he would have if those injuries had not taken place. 2024, I think, was a lot more representative, a lot more normal. Still out-qualified, though, by 0.287 seconds. And then this year, again, about 10th closer. And for reference, 2019-2020, when Stroll was teamed up with Perez, he was out-qualified by a median gap. Both years were very, very close. It was about 2.5 tenths of a second. So the fact that the median gap is smaller than that suggests that of course, maybe Stroll's gone a little bit better since then, but probably not by a massive amount. And regardless, it suggests that, at this point, perhaps, Alonso's performing at about that level or perhaps a little bit less than that level that, Perez was performing at 2019-2020. And I think even at that time, most people would say that Perez was probably not a top 10 qualifier on the grid. So I think, I know people, love Alonso, think he's going to win his third world title. I think unless Aston show up with a 2009 Braun car, I think it's going to be very, very hard if there's another team that has, one or two elite qualifiers there. Just because I think the qualifying pace is not going to be quite there for either Aston Martin driver. Now, the quality model gap 0.2798 seconds, so not a million miles off what we're seeing this year. But again, with Alonso's age, it is going to be expected to keep getting smaller the longer that these two drivers remain teammates. Now, average starting position difference, quite big compared to the median gap. So 10.79 for Alonso and then 15.31 for Stroll. Now, when we break things down race by race, the first 5 race block, third 5 race block, the gap's actually pretty small. It's about a tenth of a second. But for one reason or another, Stroll really struggled that second 5 race block, and the gap basically ballooned up to over 4/10 of a second is the median gap there. So it'll be interesting to see how this continues. I don't think Stroll will go the whole season without winning a single quality head-to-head. But if that's the case, it would be the first time that Alonso's done that to a teammate since Van Dorn in 2018. So again, that is something to keep an eye on. Does Stroll eventually out-qualify him, or does Alonso keep this streak up for the whole season? Now, moving on to our next team, we're into the top four, the top big four teams on the grid at this current stage. So first up is Mercedes, taking a look at Russell and Antonelli. So Russell, quality head-to-head 13-1 in his favor. I do think most people expected Antonelli to have a couple more flashes of brilliance, couple qualifying sessions where he out-qualified Russell. I think as a best case scenario, I think something similar to Verstappen and Ricciardo's first season as teammates together. Ricciardo was definitely the better driver. The median quality gap I think was about 0.2 of a second or so, but still there was those flashes of speed from Verstappen that year, and that's kind of what people I think were hoping from Antonelli. So he's only out-qualified Russell the one time, which I think is quite a bit less than what people would have hoped. But again, we'll have to see how things go the second half of the season. The model gap, 0.269, so about a tenth better or a tenth closer than what we've actually got, which kind of hints a little bit that he was underperforming. But to be honest, my model numbers, especially for the rookies, are a little bit pointless because it was just me kind of spitballing what I thought things would go. Now, average starting position 4.5 for Russell and 9.71 for Antonelli, so about 5 positions difference. And again, that really affects your ability to score points on a Sunday when there's that big of a difference between your two drivers. Now, another stat that's kind of not super good for Antonelli is the fact that over the course of the season, when you break it down into 5 race blocks, it's been pretty consistent, but unlike Bortoleto, it's not getting clearly better. So first block, just under 4/10. Second block, again, just under 4/10. Really, strong consistency there. But then the recent 5 race block, I think Antonelli's struggled quite a bit in the European leg of the season. That final race block, it's been over 4/10. So it jumped up by about, half a tenth or so, which again, I kind of mentioned before was within the margin of error, but still, it's definitely not a positive trend like it was for Bortoleto, for example. So again, I think there should be an increasing level of concern with Antonelli's kind of ultimate pace if these numbers kind of don't improve over the course of the season and into next year. Again, that's another big question. What kind of level of performance do we see from him then? Okay, so next up is Red Bull. Now, of course, this is another lineup, our final one in this video. That's changed from preseason. So Verstappen, Tsunoda, quality head-to-head 11-0 in Verstappen's favor. To be honest, for Tsunoda, no shame in that, especially given that he was basically put in the car mid-season. Median qualifying gap 0.510 seconds, which I think compared to Verstappen's previous teammates is a little bit on the high side. But again, when you consider that he was thrown in mid-season, it's a very difficult car. It is a little bit understandable, but even I think Albon's I think Albon's 2019 half season I think was a little bit closer than this. It might have been a little bit higher actually. I'm just kind of thinking off the top of my head. I think it might have been 5.5 tenths. Anyway, regardless, that was Albon's rookie season. This is Tsunoda's fifth full season F1. So again, very different points in their careers. I think the expectation was that Tsunoda would be a little bit closer than he is. My model was miles off, and I knew going in that this was probably going to be miles off, but which is why I developed a new model. So when your old one isn't working, that's why you go build a new one, a new better one. But yeah, the model gap 0.119 seconds. Very optimistic. I think most people would not have expected that. Average starting position, the biggest on the grid, or in terms of difference between the two, the biggest on the grid by about a country mile. 3.42 for Verstappen, 14.25 for Tsunoda. So that's 10 positions, more than 10 positions difference, almost 11 there. Definitely not really good there by Tsunoda. Again, some of that is his fault. Sometimes it would just be circumstances that would kind of go against him. Other times it was grid penalties or just starting from the pit lane. But nonetheless, qualifying has definitely been a big struggle for Tsunoda. But the good news, though, for the young Japanese driver is that it is a gap that has been improving over the course of the season. So the first 5 race block, the gap was over 7.5 tenths in a second. Second block, about 5 tenths, and then this most recent block, it's about just over 2.5 tenths, about close to 3 tenths in a second. So again, really noticeable improvement there, and I think that should be pretty promising for Red Bull. It'll be very interesting to see how that continues over the course of the rest of the season. If Tsunoda is able to maintain a gap of about 3 tenths of a second for the rest of the season, I honestly think that might be enough. Obviously depends on what happens in the races, and that's the race gap, performance gap between the two is also something that needs to be discussed. But regardless, if he can be within 3 tenths, if the race performances are okay, he actually might stay on next year, even if the first 2 blocks are not really good, even if the race performances continue to be poor, below average. At least if the underlying pace is there, they may decide, just because of a lack of better options, they may decide to hold on to him for another year. All right, moving on to Ferrari. Now, Ferrari, of course, there was a lot of interest into this particular driver lineup. Charles Leclerc argued as the best driver of his best qualifier, I should say, of his generation. I don't think anyone for the races at least would put him in the same level as Verstappen at this point. But for qualifying, I do think that, perhaps there's a bit of an argument there. And if you're curious about what my quality model thinks, you'll have to wait to see what the result is of that. I believe that'll be coming out tomorrow night. But quality head-to-head 10-4 in Leclerc's favor. Median gap 0.19 seconds. So a little bit bigger than the gap between Russell and Hamilton last year. Suggests that, maybe Leclerc's, a fraction better than Russell in qualifying, but nonetheless very, very close between Leclerc and Russell in that hypothetical matchup. Not so close between Leclerc and Hamilton. Leclerc's been the clear better driver, but I think for most people that was to be expected. Hamilton's basically 40 at this point. Leclerc's still in his prime, and given that he's one of the best qualifiers on the grid, I think many people saw that this quality head matchup would only go one way. Now, my model was not predicting that, and I knew that going into the season. You can go watch the preview I did for Ferrari, and I said, yeah, this is probably not going to happen, and indeed that's not what has happened. So the model was 0.11 seconds in Hamilton's favor, had him very, very high, had Leclerc, I think, really underrated, just because I think he underperformed a little bit relative to Sainz, and again, some of his other teammates, I think Vettel, Ericsson especially, also a little bit underrated for both of them. So I think that's why Leclerc ended up being a little bit lower. But again, in the new model, that's definitely not the case. And again, you'll see the results tomorrow. Now, average starting position for Leclerc, 5.07, Hamilton, 8.57. And within that, front-running group, Hamilton, I believe, ranks 6, only ahead of Antonelli and only ahead of Tsunoda. Now, that being said, you could argue Ferrari has been the 4th best team in qualifying, so the fact that he's even ahead of both of them should actually be a good thing. But again, I think under closer, analysis, closer examination, that was the phrase I was looking for. I do think, Hamilton has underperformed a bit in qualifying, and it'll be interesting to see how that turns around or how that changes in the second half of the season. Now, when you look at the 5-race block, again, not super good news if you're Hamilton. First race block was pretty big. It was about a 3 tenths difference, which is, again, kind of to be expected. Second block, really good. I think from Hamilton's perspective, really big improvement. It was about, half a tenth or so. And then that final block, it goes back up to about a tenth and a half. So again, not so good there. But it'll be interesting to see how this changes as the season goes along. Does it kind of ebb and flow? Does it kind of change based on what tracks we go to? Does it go depending on Hamilton's kind of comfort with the car? Those are all things that we'll have to find out as the season progresses. Now, one last team that we have to look at, and that is, of course, McLaren. So McLaren, our second lineup, that's unchanged from last couple of years, and this is one where there's definitely been a bit like the Aston one, where there's been the two teammates have gotten closer and closer over their time as teammates together. Now, quali head-to-head, I have it down as 7-7, but Saudi Arabia is technically counted as a win for Norris just because of how I calculate it, even though obviously Piastri started on pole, won the race, and Norris had a bit of a struggle that weekend. Now, median qualifying gap, 8 thousandths of a second, very, very close, almost identical times, but of course, if I switched Saudi Arabia around, it would probably be, 10 thousandths in Piastri's favor in all likelihood. Model gap, the prediction was that Norris would be in front by about a tenth and a bit. And again, I think that's what most people would have thought for these two drivers. But I think, Piastri's made a pretty big gap jump up. But I think at the same time, I think Norris has definitely struggled in qualifying this year relative to the previous 2 years. He, of course, was not comfortable with the steering, the suspension, and that's why they brought that suspension upgrade around Canada or so. And since then, we'll look at the next graph, but since then, obviously, I think things have been a little bit more in Norris's favor. Average starting position, kind of like I implied before, with that, the way I calculated Saudi Arabia being as a win for Norris and not Piastri does kind of slightly altered things, but Piastri does have the better average starting position, 2.43 compared to Norris's 3.29. And when you compare 2023 to 2024, 1.8 tenths basically 2023, that dropped to about 1.1 tenths the following year. So it's about 8 hundredths difference. And then this year it's been about another 8 hundredths, 9 tenths difference there, or about, yeah, tenths difference between those years. So again, Piastri has made very good progress, and it'll be interesting to see second half this season and then also next year. Does that gap continue to decrease, or in this case, would it mean that Piastri would actually be increasing his gap over Norris? We shall see. Now, when you look at the 5 race averages, first 5 races, it was about less, basically a quarter of a tenth in Norris's favor. Second 5 race block, this is where Norris struggled the most. It was about 2 tenths in Piastri's favor, and this is where Piastri got most of his pole positions, actually. And then we get to the third block, and again, it's back to being in favor of Norris, and this is when that suspension upgrade came for McLaren, and again, goes back from 2 tenths in Piastri's favor to being about 25 thousandths in Norris's favor. So it'll be really interesting to see how things go over the rest of the season. I do think now with this suspension upgrade that that Norris has, I do think that he's probably going to be more often than not in the lead McLaren when it comes to his qualifying for the rest of the season. But that being said, Piastri's made a really big improvement this year. But going up to, looking at the tracks that we're racing at, a lot of these tracks are tracks that he struggled at the last couple of years, especially the tracks in the Americas. So it'll be interesting to see how they compare there, especially given that the title fight is so close between them, with the two of them separated by 9 points. But there you go. That's all for this video. Quali head-to-head review for all 10 F1 teams. So thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.